Welcome to Missions Life, where we share resources and encouragement for current missionaries, future missionaries, and those praying for missionaries. Missions can be hard, and we want to help you face the challenges of life, leadership, and ministry. We want your life to bear fruit for the gospel wherever you are. I'm Kyle Ferran, here with my co-host and wife, Heather. Well, today on the podcast, we have with us Richard Blackaby. Richard is the president of Blackaby Ministries International and the eldest son of Henry and Marilynn. Richard has his Ph.D. in church history from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He served as a senior pastor and as a seminary president. And Richard travels extensively, speaks internationally on spiritual leadership, experiencing God, revival, and God in the marketplace. Richard regularly works with Christian CEOs of Fortune 500 companies and hosts the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. He and his wife, Lisa, live in Atlanta. Their 3 children all serve in ministry, and they're very grateful for their 8 grandchildren. And we're very excited today to be talking about Richard's book, Spiritual Leadership. And this is an excellent book. There's so much leadership material available today. And I just found this book extremely helpful for how it looked at so many of those different leadership theories and principles, but then stepped back to evaluate whether or not they help us live as a leader that is pleasing to God. So, Richard, thank you so much for taking the time to write that book. There's a lot that is in that we won't be able to touch it everything, but thank you for joining us on the show as well.
Oh, it's my privilege.
We've really been looking forward to this conversation, and let's just jump right in with what's a good definition of leadership. There's a lot of different definitions out there.
Yeah, there's and if anyone who's read leadership books knows that somewhere embedded in a good number of them, they'll try to define that. And I think it's actually probably a good thing to do, just to say, well, because leadership can mean so many things to people these days. In fact, I talk about leadership with people, and sometimes they almost see it as a bad word. There's some Christian circles, they see that as something that's negative. And so I think it's always great just to say, well, what do I mean by that? And for us in our book, we define it as moving people onto God's agenda. And so probably the 3 key words for us, one is the idea of moving. John Maxwell and some folks like that have popularized the concept of influence. But I prefer the word moving just because you can influence someone and they can still be right where you left them. They just, we like to say, you could throw a smoke bomb into a classroom and you've influenced the room, but you haven't, and you might have moved them, but you haven't necessarily got them where you want them to be. But moving means when you arrive on the mission field, when you arrive at your church, your business, you get your people where they are. And your job is to move them from where they were when you got there to where you know God wants them to be. So you have to move them. And there's a lot of times you can hold meetings, you can cast vision, you can have a PowerPoint presentation, but if people haven't moved, then you haven't led. You've just held a meeting. But then you also, the other key word is God's agenda. And, a lot of every leader, I would say, is driven by an agenda. It's just a matter of whether it's God's or it's theirs or it's someone else's, trying to please people. But when you move people to where God wants them to be, now that's real spiritual leadership, especially. Parents can be tempted to move their kids onto their agenda. I want you to go to college where I went to school. I want you to be the same profession that I was. I want you to live near us, whatever it might be. But to go before God and say, God, you gave me this child. What was in your heart? What did you intend when you created this child and you entrusted them into my home? And my job is not to just impose what I want on them, but once I know what's on God's heart for each child, then I just mobilize everything I have, every resource to try to get them there and be a part of what God is doing. And then lastly, just the word people. You don't just move organizations, you move people. And incredibly, there's a lot of leaders out there that love leading, they just don't like people. Leadership would be great if you didn't have to deal with people, and yet leadership is a people business, and so you have to focus on them. And sometimes I think there's famously been leaders who slashed and burned and cut and terrorized the people in their organization, trying to get their organization to be what they wanted it to be, but they neglected the people. And so leadership always centers around people ultimately, and so you've got to be good at working with them if you want to move them. And so that's basically the definition. And I'll tell you, my dad and I, we wrestled with that definition when we were writing this book, Dad had so many different, he kept wanting to add stuff and say, well, it's this and it's that, and it's not. Well, Dad, we can't put the whole book in our definition. Let's try to keep this as succinct as we possibly can. And I really am pleased with how we came out on that, because I still think that that definition can stand up. And I think it really covers the essence of what leading really means.
Yeah, that's really good. And I appreciate just that focus there on making sure that we're evaluating, it's God's agenda. And I think that's a key one that's left out of so many of just the general leadership definitions.
Yeah. Well, that's why I was just talking to some people that are looking for their next pastor and for their church. And I said, look, if you're interviewing someone and they already have an agenda for your church and they haven't even arrived yet, just keep on going. Because if they already know what they're going to do before they've even had time to pray about it and be on the field and talk about it, you'll see missionaries the same way. They haven't even gotten on the field yet, but they already know what they're going to do. And I would say, well, wait a minute, that sounds like it's your agenda. That sounds like you've already got a plan. But, every assignment I've ever had, when people ask me, what are you going to do when you get here? I said, well, I'm going to take a lot of time to pray. I'm going to ask a lot of questions. I'm going to talk to a lot of the people on the field, the team. And then I'm going to just ask God, let me know what's on your heart here. God, how would I know? I was working in a different job before this one. I was working on a different agenda there, but I want to know what God's agenda is for this place and these people, and that takes some time to find it first. Don't assume that because something makes sense to you that it's God's agenda.
Isn't that the truth?
And God is often midstream will reveal what his agenda was all along, which can be different than what we thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
Well, in the book, one of the things you warn about is just an uncritical acceptance of like secular leadership theories and Christian leadership. How do you encourage leaders to evaluate what's helpful, what's harmful?
Yeah, well, it's not like everything in a secular book is bad. I've got lots of secular books, but what I think we have to remember is Isaiah 55 verses 8 and 9. God says, "My ways are not your ways. My thoughts are not your thoughts." And we really don't believe that. We just assume that if something gets us all excited and charged up, then it must be from God. I wrote a book last year called The Ways of God. I just took about 2 years just to immerse myself in the way God does things. And it's not the same as the way the world does. And I know a lot of very fine, sincere Christian people that are working very hard for God, and then they wonder why God's not blessing. And I would say, well, because with God, what you do really matters, obviously, but how you do it matters just as much. And it's possible to actually do the right thing, but to do it the wrong way. I see the church all the time trying to do God's work, but they do it the world's way. And then God just doesn't bless, because if you do something the world's way, the world gets the credit. When you do it God's way, he gets the credit, and it glorifies him. And so how you do something really matters. And there's a lot of Christian leaders who don't necessarily believe that. They just say, well, it doesn't really matter as long as you get the job done. I'd say, well, not with God. That's not how it works. And so that's why I would just say with secular books, it's going to present you a lot of the world's best thinking. And now the interesting thing about secular leadership is oftentimes they stumble upon God's wisdom along the way. And so they think it's a breakthrough in leadership insight, and all they've done is discover Proverbs or something, and what God's been saying for millennia. And so sometimes, there's lots of overlap there, but you just have to be careful, because sometimes secular leadership can really come close to manipulation. It's just here's ways the world has figured out to get people to do what you want them to do. Whereas God relies upon the Holy Spirit. He's got a whole different armory. He's got lots of tools that the secular world doesn't even have access to. And so you want to, like I read secular books often, but I always got my Bible next to me to say, well, does that line up? Does that, and just, my dad used to say, if he had a plan and the plan made perfect sense to him, then he assumed it probably hadn't come from God, because
I love that.
Because God's ways just aren't our ways. If there's not something that kind of stretches you or disturbs you or scares you about the plan, then it's probably just something you came up with. Because we're going to come up with plans that we know are doable for us with our skill set, our resources. And God comes up with plans that are doable only when he's a part of the process. So, yeah, so there's a lot to there's a lot to say about that, but I think it's one of the great temptations of spiritual leaders is trying to do spiritual work the world's way. And you can learn from them, and there's some fundamental principles that are just kind of universal, like delegating, delegating work. Well, atheists do that, Christians do that, but as soon as you start getting into the strategies and directions and goals and visions, you're getting into territory where you need to be sure you're getting it from God instead of from yourself or the world.
Yeah, so that leads us right into the next question I was going to ask.
I was just going to mention one other thing on that. Something that came to mind as you were talking there is one of the helpful principles for me, just that reminder, and you kind of touched on it, was who does this give glory to? Or who gets the credit for this? And that's can be a really helpful filter there. Is like, if this is going to make us look really good, it's like, hey, our strategy knocked it out of the park here. It's not giving glory to God. So oftentimes that's not going to be an indication of God's strategy there, because God always works for his glory and for his praise to be seen. So if our strategy puts us in the way and gets in the way of God's glory being seen, that's an indication that maybe this is from us and not God.
Yeah. And if it makes you indispensable, where you keep coming up with plans and everyone is saying, man, what would we do without Kyle? If he wasn't running this thing, we don't want to even attempt anything if Kyle's not here, because it just seemed like he's so good at this. And as opposed to, obviously a leader is going to be important in the process, but if they realize, no, it's God led Kyle every time, and he'll lead us too. And we've learned just to trust God the same way, Kyle and Heather do. And so you can just kind of tell the methodology. If the way you're doing it just makes you the hero, and everybody knows we can't do it without him, then you're probably not doing it God's way.
Yeah, well said.
So how can leaders balance wise planning, but being fully trusting God and looking for God's direction?
Yeah, some people misunderstood at times what my dad would teach on that, because they would say, well, it sounds to me like, Henry didn't do any planning. He just got up every morning and said, God, what are you up to today? But planning is good. Planning is biblical. But God just has to be central to the planning process. It's not that he's against it. It's just that too often we go off and do all the planning on our own, and then we present our plans to God and ask him to bless them. And that's not the pattern. The pattern is going to God and hearing what's on his heart, what's on his mind. And then, sometimes we also make the mistake in that we'll let God give us the big picture, and then we assume that we're supposed to work out all the details ourselves. And again, that becomes a breakdown. And so we're fine with the big picture. Okay, God, I think I got this. You want me to reach this city for Christ? I'm in. Okay, I got to go. I got a lot of work to do. And God would say, well, wait a minute, I didn't tell you how to do it. So you need him for the big picture, but also the details. But whenever you're talking to God, you better have your pen and paper handy, because he's going to give you specific directions. And it's fine to project ahead and be praying about God. What do we do first, and which we could go into 10 different cities. Lord, which city is the priority? I know which one's the biggest, so if we just go purely by where's the most people, we'll go there. But maybe you're really more at work at the third biggest city, and we would see revival if we just went there. But human wisdom says go to the most populated place first. But when God's a part of the process, he would say, well, that's fine, except that's not where all the action is right now. Come over here, and there'll be a great harvest. And so you plan, but let God guide you in the planning process. And I remember years ago, there was one of the largest Christian organizations in the United States they asked me to come in and talk about this book with them, and they had all their top vice presidents and regional leaders, and I came in, and the boardroom was just surrounded with whiteboards, and it was covered. They'd been brainstorming all morning, and a typical way that we brainstorm and plan and look to the future is, okay, what do you think is a priority? Where do you think we should go? What do you think we should focus? And they just brainstormed all their best thinking. And so I came in, and before I'd ever seen that, my talk was about whose agenda are you on? Are you just coming up with your plans? And we pray at the beginning of the session, God guide us. Then the whole day we're just putting our best thinking on the whiteboard, and then at the end of the day, we pray and ask God to bless all of our best thinking. And so we got to, and it got pretty awkward because it was clear that everywhere in the room was evidence that that's just exactly what they've been doing. And so at the end, my time was up. I sat down, and their top guy stood up, and he basically said, After what we've just heard, I've got two suggestions." He said, "First, I think we need to pray, get down on our knees and pray and ask God to forgive us for presuming that we would tell him what he needs to do. And secondly, I think we need to erase everything on this board and start over by asking God what he would put on this board, and start with that, and then let God guide us to know how it all fits together." But I see it all the time, all the time. Christian leaders, organizations, they think because they open in prayer that God has guided the whole day with everything that they put all their best thinking. And, I'm just at the point of saying, God, the world needs more than our best thinking. It needs God's best thinking. And so God help us when so often we just give them our best when what people need is God's best.
God doesn't give us a map. He told Abraham to go to the land I will show you. And it's kind of a step-by-step process that we have to go through to walk with him. And as he reveals his agenda little by little as we walk with him.
Yeah. And I would say, if you have a 10-year plan, I mean, most people don't look at 10 years as way too far out with the way things are changing these days. But even a 5-year plan, that's fine to have one, but just hold on to it loosely. I know people, their plan becomes their Bible, and God introduces a brand new, huge opportunity that dwarfs everything that's on the plan, but they don't want to release the plan. They want to stick to it. I'd say it's fine to have a general, direction that you're going, but just let God interrupt your plan anytime he chooses, because it will always be an upgrade when he does.
Yeah, I think we can really rob ourselves of the excitement of serving the God of the universe when we micromanage God, or when we get mad that our plans, and I put that in air quotes, our plans have changed. That was one of the biggest things that drew me into giving my life over to missions, was the fact that God, take me anywhere, move me to where you're working. Don't let me, plan my own steps, because all of a sudden that sounded very limiting and very boring. We can really miss a huge, exciting, joyful component of serving our God when we, map out the next 10 years, but then fail to watch where God's showing up and moving us.
Heather, that's one of the great struggles for leaders. A lot of leaders don't want to see themselves as servants. They want to be the leader. But my dad was he was the greatest man of God I ever knew. And but whenever he signed a book or something, he always signed his servant, Henry Blackaby. That's how he always signed it. And he had world leaders coming to seek his counsel. He was invited into the White House and all kinds of places, but he saw himself as the servant of God. And I remember he was speaking at a big meeting somewhere, and the guy introducing him was so worried that he had like 3 pages of bio, and he was planning to read all 3 pages, and he was worried that he might still miss something. And so he was like, "Dr. Blackaby, is there anything else besides what's in here that I also need to say?" And my dad, sensing that would take forever, he finally just said, "Listen, this is what I want you to say. When it's my time to speak, just say, 'Here's Henry Blackaby, a servant of God.'" And the guy said, "Well, but that's it? Like, don't you want me to list how many books you've read and how many degrees you have?" And he said, "That's all you want? That's all you want me to say?" And my dad had responded, "What else could you say? I mean, what else could you add to the fact that I'm a servant of God? How could you make it any better?" And so that was his attitude. So I think if we had that attitude, then we wouldn't be so uptight about letting God do the planning and guiding us day by day.
Absolutely.
Well, I wanted to touch on just another section of the book there on just comparing spiritual and political leadership. And this kind of ties into what you were just talking about there, of like who's getting the accolades there of it. But the book contrasts spiritual statesmen with politicians who follow public opinion. And you encourage leaders to be statesmen instead of politicians, standing for what's right instead of for what's popular. So how can spiritual leaders stay true to God's agenda instead of trying to please people? And also, how do they develop that resilience that's needed to stand up against criticism so that they can be that statesman for the Lord.
Yeah, it's interesting. Now I'm a history major, so I love reading biographies and learning from history. But today, most people don't know what a statesman or statesperson is. They think it's a bad thing. In history, in secular history, someone like a Winston Churchill, or Abraham Lincoln, or people like that would be people in the political secular world that were very unpopular at a time because they kept holding on to beliefs that were not popular, and people said, you're going to lose the election if you hold to these views. Churchill was very much against Hitler before World War II, and that was not a popular belief. They thought we can reason with Hitler. Let's not make him mad. Let's not say things that offend him. And so that in secular history, it's people that knew what was right, and they were not going to be deterred just because that was an unpopular opinion, and it might even cost them an election. Might cost them personally, but statespeople recognize it's about the organization. It's not about me. It's not about my career, about my retirement plan, my popularity. Every time I've ever been hired to lead an organization or to serve in some place, I've felt I'm here to serve this organization. I'm here to serve God. It's not about building my career, my brand, my influence. And so I'm going to do whatever makes this organization better. And sometimes that calls for really hard things. I was a seminary president at one point, and I ultimately had to fire the most popular staff person that worked there for moral issues. But I lost students. I had people say that I was too harsh, but it was gross moral failure, and I had no choice. And I had people very angry with me for what I did. But I just said, you know what? I'm not in this job to be popular. I'm in this job to serve God and honor Him, and to do what's best for the organization. Too many people today are doing what they think is best for them, not for the organization. But a statesperson has a bigger view. And the other thing I've just found with ministers in general, certainly ministers in America, is they are major people pleasers. There's just so many people-pleasing tendencies among the servants of God. We really want to be liked, and I was largely like that when I started out in ministry. I mean, I was a pretty popular person as a young person. I liked to be liked. And it bothered me if someone didn't like me. It's like you must not know me very well, because most people really like me, but I began to realize you can't lead very long until you will start rubbing some people the wrong way. You'll do things they don't want you to do, and you're going to have to decide who you want to please. Do you want to please God, or do you want to please people? And a statesperson always takes the long view and the big view. Not this will make people like me today. It may grossly harm the organization long term, but at least today I'm a hero. A statesperson always takes the long view and says, this is going to be painful today, but 10 years from now, we'll be a much stronger, better organization because we took this stand. The statesperson walks in and says, yeah, but there's some gross sin here. There's some things that don't honor God here. I know it's not going to be popular to say that, but it's going to have to be addressed. And so I think this is a day that desperately needs statespersons who step up and say, there's a reason God hasn't been blessing, and we've got to address it and get right so that we're in a position for a wonderful future. But it typically takes some hard decisions in the meantime, and a lot of leaders just aren't willing to make those.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. A lot of the steps that God does call us to take go against popular opinion, go against the easy thing that the easy path we see.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean that, to be a statesperson, you have to be obnoxious all the time. As I'm a statesperson, everyone's mad at me. Well, that's not what it means to be a statesperson. It just means it's not that you're obnoxious. You can be very gracious statesperson, but you just very graciously, but tenaciously hold on to what really matters, what's really important.
One of the key points I made in my book, Overflowing, was just personally, if we desire God's blessing on our life, we have to be removing sin out of our life and not allowing that to remain. And you see the same thing in groups as well, like with the Israelites, when there was sin that they were allowing to remain in the camp, that God's blessing wasn't there. And I think that's such an important thing for leaders to be, as you were doing there with the university, having someone be removed. And that's a hard thing, not a popular decision, but at the same time, it's like, who are we before God? And
Yeah.
God desires to bless those that honor him by being holy and keeping a organizational culture and standard of holiness, just like we're supposed to do in the church. And that's not always popular, but
No.
if we
No.
desire God's blessing, we need to be able to have the courage to stand up and do those things. So
Yeah.
well said on that. Thank you.
Another popular current trend among leadership is measuring results, growth, numbers, making these more important than maybe spiritual health. How can leaders resist that pressure to focus on what we would call external markers and instead really keep spiritual maturity and health as a goal? You can kind of get torn in two directions that way.
Yeah, that's true, because what I found, and I would just say this, leaders ought to get results. If you're not getting any results, I wonder if you're leading, because there's a pendulum, sometimes say it's just about, we're just want to just please, have a good time with God here. But they haven't started any churches, haven't led anybody to Christ. They've not gathered any groups, but they are having a great time with God, and they know that God doesn't care about results. Who just loves them just the way they are. I would say, well, you're kind of getting that wrong. When you're walking with God, stuff's going to happen. There will be results. But the problem is sometimes we assume that if we've gathered a crowd that God must be pleased, or that's God. There's lots of ways to draw a crowd. There's a lot of cults and false religions that have drawn large crowds. That doesn't mean God's pleased with them, that God's blessing them. That just means they're good marketers. That just means they're giving the crowds what they want. And you'll get a crowd every time if you do that. So, the temptation is that let's just fill up the building, and then that'll really glorify God. But when you watch how Jesus did things, there's lots of times where he actually said things that made the crowd go away, or he escaped the crowd, or he said things that offended the crowd. And it's like, that is poor marketing, Jesus. We need to help you with some of your presentation here. So, the challenge sometimes is to say, well, numbers are up, money is up, attendance is up, but does that mean that God is pleased? Or have I just sort of sold out, and I'm just giving the crowd what they want? And so for me in recent years, what I've started doing more, because I do think there should be results. Leaders are wrong to think results don't matter to God. They do, but the word I've used more in recent days is fruit. There should be fruit. In fact, John 15:8, Jesus said, this is how you glorify the Father, basically. He said, is that you bear much fruit. You produce much fruit. That's how you glorify God. Now, I think you're always safer to use a biblical term than a secular term. And so results aren't necessarily a bad term, but it can be misunderstood. But fruit, the only way that you produce fruit is when you abide in Christ. Fruit is a direct result of your walk with God. And so what Jesus was saying is, when you're walking with me properly, there will be much fruit. And that much fruit will glorify God. And so I want much fruit. Anyone who says, well, God doesn't care if you produce much fruit or not, I would say, well, if you want to glorify God a lot, it does matter. Because he said that's how you glorify him, you produce fruit. But the only way to produce it is to abide in him. And so that's the safeguard right there. Because you can go out and make lots of things happen and not abide in Christ. But you can't produce spiritual fruit unless you're abiding in him. So I've let that become my metric in recent days, to say, if I'm meeting with other leaders, I want to say, so where's the fruit? Yeah, you had, pretty solid attendance, but that's not necessarily, attendance isn't necessarily fruit. It's the kind of thing that only changed life, a Christ-like character. There's certain things only the Spirit of God can produce. And so that's fruit. And so that's what I'm looking for. You could just offer to give away a free bicycle to everybody who attends, and you'll fill the building up. That's not spiritual fruit. That's manipulation. But there's some things you have to say only God could do that. And that's fruit. And so you should be fruit conscious. In fact, that's why in John 15, Jesus says, if there's an area of your leadership, your ministry, your life that's not producing fruit, you need to prune it or get rid of it. And as a leader, that has driven me in recent years to say, time's too short to have fruitless activities. Things that I do and I invest my time and effort, money in, that it's really not producing much fruit. Now, it may be things I do and people like it. People thank me and say, hey, I love it when you do that. Well, Yeah, I'm glad you do, but the problem is when I do that, I'm not producing any fruit. So I'm going to have to prune that out of my schedule. I know it makes me popular. It even kind of makes me look like a good leader, but the problem is it's not fruitful. And
Hmm.
I want to be fruit driven, not just results driven. And so I think there is a difference there. But to say God just doesn't care if anything happens, that's not true. God's very intentional, and the vine dresser is an expert in producing fruit. He wants the maximum amount of fruit out of every servant that he knows there can be. But the way you get that is by abiding in him, in Christ. So it's counterintuitive to most leadership teaching, just abide more. It's interesting, even in Christian circles, we have lots of leadership conferences. We don't have many abiding conferences. And yet it's in abiding that you get much fruit.
Hmm.
What advice would you give to a leader then that wants to kind of make a shift from just measurable things to really wanting to measure fruit or to go after the fruit? What are some steps a leader could take?
Yeah, well, first, I think you have to recognize what fruit looks like. So you can't measure something you don't even recognize. So again, yeah, we did that and attendance was up. Well, yeah, so if you're going to be chasing attendance, you might not be chasing fruit. So identify what that is, what is fruit, and then take a real serious inventory of your activities, and are these being fruitful? I've said this to folks, there's some people even that will consume your time. I mean, they'll have coffee with you every day if you'll let them, but they never change. They never become more Christ-like. They don't start walking in obedience. But they're lonely and they may be socially awkward, and you'll at least be their friend and have coffee with them. But you just invest this. You think that somehow, well, as a Christian, I guess someone's got to love this person and spend time with them, even though there's no fruit as a result. But then you've got other people that if you ever took any time at all to get to know that neighbor that lives 3 houses down, there'd be all kinds of spiritual fruit, but you don't have time because your calendar is filled with fruitless activities. And I've just gotten to the point now, I guess as you get older, you just realize you don't have a lot of time to waste on unfruitful investments. And so to just take an inventory to say, I'm putting a lot of time in this. I mean, another huge one is just social media. On a typical week, I spend this much time on social media. How much fruit has resulted in my time on social media? I'm not saying that it can't produce some fruit, but it depends how you're using it. And to just start to get kind of ruthless about that and say, yeah, this it makes me look good, but I'm not seeing fruit. And so I need to adjust something. And a lot of times we might not have to completely overhaul something. It might just be the way we're doing something is not very fruitful. We can still do it. Let's just do it in a more Christ-focused way, maybe a more humble way, using God's ways instead of the world's ways. And all of a sudden there would be fruit. But anymore, that's just a message I keep driving home when I'm with leaders, is because a lot of times if you're supervising some other leaders and you ask them to give an inventory, what they'll say is, they'll say, well, Kyle, Heather, I've been really busy. I've been really busy. And my response would be, you're not called to be busy. You're called to be fruitful. And sometimes we conceal our fruitlessness with our busyness.
Mhm.
Well, I've got all these meetings. I've got all these emails I have to answer. I've got but how fruitful has that been? All those meetings you're running to, where's the fruit from those meetings? And I think if we really held ourselves accountable for fruitfulness, we might stop a bunch of things that we're doing. Churches are famous for that. Having meetings and programs that haven't been fruitful for years, but it's what they've always done. It's what people like. I'd said we're not driven by what people like. We're called to be fruitful. So if this program is not producing fruit, I don't care how much our people like it. It's based on where's the fruit. We have this big program every Easter and everybody loves it, but we haven't seen anyone converted from it. There's no new people drawn to Christ from it, but everybody likes when we do it, so let's keep on doing that. I'd say no. It's got to be fruit driven. So that's where I think you need to. You really have to identify what is it we're looking for, and it's not what the world looks for. Not just numbers that people liked it. People appreciate you when you do that. That's the world likes that kind of stuff, but But God's servant needs to be, we're going to give an account to the vine dresser, and he's looking for fruit. And so if he can't find fruit in something I'm doing, I probably shouldn't be doing it.
That's really good. So one of the things you mentioned in your book is that spiritual leadership starts with who you are. And it emphasizes integrity, humility, obedience, that leadership flows from our character, not just a position. So what are some practical ways for leaders to build and protect their character?
Yeah, if you've looked at how God has used people mightily through the generations, oftentimes it's not that they were necessarily the most skilled orator, that they were the best organized person. People just want to be around them. People would say this about my dad all the time. They would just say, when you were in his presence, you just felt like you were in the presence of God. You just felt like he had just come from Mount Sinai or something, just being around him. And my dad was not necessarily the most eloquent preacher, but well, I tell you, many a time as he was just sharing from God's word, the altar would just fill up. He was right in the middle of a sermon. People would just start coming because it was just so powerful. And that came not so much from what he did as from who he was. And I think we underestimate that ultimately your doing comes out of your being. Who you are will be reflected in what you do. And so you got to start at the root, which is your character. So what I would say is, number one, you have to value character. Yeah, if you really truly believe that the godlier, the holier your character is, the more mightily God will use you, then you're going to be giving attention to character. Our problem is we don't necessarily believe that, and we think it's our hard work will get results. So we focus on hard work more than we focus on character. But if you really do value that, then you will give attention to character. And you can go too far with this, but I don't think it's wrong to keep your character before you and keep an eye on it and be aware of, the fruit of the Spirit is something that just needs to be a pattern that you keep in front of you all the time. And to say, joy, gentleness. Do I have some of all that fruit, but do I have as much as Jesus has? And if not, God, I know people that can get very intentional to say, this entire year, I just feel like God wants me to focus on this aspect. And, it could be humility that is the issue. And you just realize you're still pretty prideful. You still love to be recognized. It still stings when everybody's talking about how well this ministry went, but no one is pointing out that you're the one that planned it. It was your idea. They're just grateful to God that God worked, but it's like, yeah, but I'd like some credit, recognition. And you begin to realize, you know what, pride still just has a grip in my life because I still need that recognition. I still need to be thanked. And then I would just say, then let the Spirit of God just begin to just work on you. Just keep, until you're exactly like Jesus, there ought to always be something that God's working on in our life. And, my dad was that way again. He was such a giant in my life. But I remember when he was 65 years old, he was at my house and we had one day and we're going to do some writing. And so I wanted to get all the writing out of him I could. So I'd said, Dad, let's try to get started at 6:00 in the morning. Do you think you can be ready? I said, I'll set up the coffee machine the night before. You just have to push this button and you'll have coffee. And I said, 6:00, I expect you to be at your post, ready to go. Well, I get down at 6 and he has already been up and drunk the entire first pot of coffee. He's been up since 4. And so I have to make a second pot of coffee. And while I'm doing that, Dad says, Richard, let me read to you what I read this morning. And I'm thinking he's read some, Christian book or leadership book or something. And he's been reading out of Proverbs. And then he said, as God was showing me here these verses, he led me to Isaiah, and he's telling me what God said in Isaiah. And then he said, then God took me to Jeremiah, and he says a similar thing here. And he's got all this notepad that he's reading through. And then he says, God took me to the Gospels. And finally, he's worked through 12 pages of notes. And it's 6:00 in the morning. I'm getting up at 6, and God's already given my dad 12 pages of notes. And then Dad looks at me, he's got tears in his eyes. He said, God showed me this morning that there's still so much he needs to do in my life. And I'm like, at 6 in the morning, you've already got 12 pages of notes of what God still wants to work into your life and how to make you more like Jesus. And I thought that's why people would travel around the world to be in this man's presence, because he's just never sat. He's 65. He's a best-selling author, Christian leader. And yet it's like, but I'm not there yet. I'm not there yet. There's still more. And so that's sort of been my pattern to say, at any given time, you should be able to ask me. And so, Richard, what aspect of character is God working on right now in your heart, your life? And, how's it going? And just always, if you're really listening to the Spirit of God, he knows exactly where we are not yet completely like Jesus, and he knows what's a priority. He knows what aspects of our character are actually harming our ministry right now, harming our witness, robbing God of his glory. And so if you'll listen to him, he will let you know. I've often found if I listen to my wife, she will let me know where my character is not yet where I ought to be. And to have a humility just to, I say that jokingly, but there literally, truly have been times where I was out socially somewhere with my wife, and on the way home, my wife, she's very gracious. I remember one time coming home from a meeting, and she was just very silent. She wasn't saying anything, which is not always a good sign. And I know full well that if I ask her what's wrong, I may not like what she has to say. So I'm kind of wrestling with, do I want to know? Do I want to go there? Do I want to open that door? But I finally said, Lisa, what's wrong? And essentially what happened was we had lunch with some friends, and the friends asked me, they said, Richard, where have you been? We haven't seen you. What countries, what cities, where have you been? And they said, what have you been writing? What books are you working on? So I just kept answering their questions. She said, but on the way home, it's like, but you did all the talking. You just talked about yourself the whole time. I said, well, but I was just answering their questions. And she's like, well, but you could have asked them questions. You could have turned the conversation to them. You just went on and on about yourself. And of course, I didn't like that. The last thing I wanted to hear from my wife. But as I got home, I just realized, but she was right. And God just used her. And I just realized, well, there's still pride. You just as soon talk about yourself as to show interest in someone else. And I just thought, well, I don't want that character. I don't want to be that person. And so God said, well, then let me help you understand some things you're going to need to change about how you relate to people. And so, I've been at it for a long time myself, and yet God keeps on reminding me, but you're not fully like Jesus yet. Let me show you what you need to work on next. And so it's a lifelong adventure to become like Jesus, but that's really what character development is. I'm not yet like him, so I still have to work at it. And unfortunately, a lot of people, especially if you're a Christian leader, you sort of get treated like you've arrived. If you're a leader, you must really be godly, and in your heart there's still lots of areas that aren't as godly as they should be. But I'll tell you, just as a leader, no matter what else you're working on, be sure that you've got your character always on the working table, just trying to become a little more like Jesus year by year.
I think that truth there was like really what God kind of kicked me in the teeth with. It's just like who you are is more important than what you do. What you do flows out of who you are. And if we really desire a ministry that's blessed by God, we need to align ourselves with God. We need to be pursuing our character first, because it doesn't matter with what we do. It's going to be God's blessing. God's going to cause the fruit to grow. So we need to be getting in line with that. And that was just such a pivotal shift of focus to change the focus from what I did to who I was, and then to trust God for results. Yeah.
When we're going to meet with our supervisor, they typically don't ask us who we are. They ask us what we've done. So we focus on what we're being held accountable for. So I would say, as a leader or a supervisor, ask the right questions. If you want them to grow in character, hold them somehow accountable for that. But if you just want numbers, results, activities, then that's where they'll focus. And so, I think in part we have to focus on character as well. And I just really believe that God's way of doing things typically is he always works in you before he works through you. And he doesn't give large assignments to small characters. So if you want God to do more through you, the key is not to work harder, it's to have a bigger character, to have a more godly character that he can entrust with bigger assignments. I've seen a lot of leaders who had a job that they manipulated their way into a bigger job. And then when they got it, their character couldn't sustain it. They had this big title, this big responsibility, but they had a shallow, small character. And it's a recipe for disaster. You just realize this person's too small for that job. They haven't grown, but their job now is bigger than they are. So I've just found, even just selfishly, if I want God to do greater things through me, then I've got to just be open and just pay the price, as painful as it might be, for him first to work in me.
Yeah, and along those bigger assignments that you mentioned, as you look through Scripture, they weren't exactly real easy assignments. And there was a
No,
lot of trouble and trials that went with those. And so I think we forget that a lot of times too, that
yeah,
God uses trials and difficulties, and it's going to require a lot of faith to trust him to work through those, that it's going to be way, way bigger beyond us. It's going to be an impossible situation to work through
yeah,
without his grace.
yeah. That's very true.
One of the things that you mentioned in the book, there's a quote: more than any other single thing leaders do, their prayer life determines their effectiveness. What are some big obstacles leaders face in maintaining a deep prayer life? And what would you say to them to help overcome those obstacles?
Yeah, there's I think in our minds we all know prayer is important, but many leaders don't live like that. It's important. They feel like activity is more important than prayer. So if something's got to go, the prayer is typically what goes. I believe in prayer, I just don't have time to do it. And Jesus said, John 15:5, apart from me, you can do nothing. We don't believe that. If we did believe that, we'd be abiding all the time. And prayer is, in large part, it's abiding. Prayer is not an activity; it's a relationship. Prayer is where we are abiding, we're communing, and we're doing a lot of listening to what God has to say. Prayer is not for us to go and lay all of our thoughts and concerns on God. Prayer primarily is an opportunity for God to take what's on his heart and put it over our heart. And now we know what God cares about. We know what God is thinking about this. And so I used to do a lot more talking when I prayed. Now I'm trying to do a lot more listening, where I just present if you're in a new mission field, you need to just regularly lift up your mission field, your city, your region, your country before God and say, God, what's on your heart for this place? What is it you want to see happen here? When I know that, then I know how to focus my life, my ministry. But typically we figure out what we think we want to do, and then we pray and ask God to do that. And then that's typically not the kind of prayer God blesses. So nothing happens, and then we sort of think that prayer is useless then. Well, I prayed and God didn't give me what I asked for. So but when you are praying and hearing from God, I tell you, when God starts to put what's on his heart over your heart, it will overwhelm you. To even have a glimpse at what is in God's heart for the people you're ministering to, you'll never see those people the same after that. You'll never view your problems the same once you realize what's in his heart right now. And so I think it's very embarrassing for a lot of leaders to acknowledge that they don't really know how to pray, that they're not really praying biblically. They're just saying prayers, but they're not really communing and abiding with Christ. And when someone tells me I just find prayer boring, I struggle with prayer, in part that alerts me that you need to learn how to do it, because Jesus could pray all through the night and still have to be interrupted to be told, we're out of time now, because he couldn't get enough of it. And of course, no one's ever had a ministry like Jesus had. So I've often been convicted by that, because I'm a doer. I'm a person of action. I'm very task oriented, and if you're task oriented, praying can kind of seem like not nearly as a useful way to spend your busy time. I can get a lot of tasks done instead of being praying. But if you've ever prayed and then seen God open doors or bring down walls that only he could, then you realize, man, I mean, in one day, God did more than I've done in 2 years. Maybe it is more valuable to pray, because when God's Spirit feels free to begin working and doing what only he can do, I just got to get out of the way and just let God do what only he can. Then you start to understand why prayer is so important. But for a lot of us, we honestly have more faith in our hard work than we do in our prayer life. So we work hard and don't pray very much. But when you see what God does, when you read about the great revivals in history, where whole nations were shaken and drawn to Christ, you realize that didn't come from hard work. And you'll never be able to work hard enough to see a whole nation coming to Christ. But you can pray in such a way that that God begins to do what only he can do. So, prayer is not a substitute for work, but it will accomplish far more, and it will empower the work that you do afterward.
When we spend most of our time on activity and not the prayer, also happens there is that gets in the way of God's glory being seen. So if God were to bless it and we had not prioritize prayer, and what gets the credit?
Yeah.
Our activity. And so it goes against God's desire to glorify himself and to show his glory. So it kind of goes completely opposite of how God says he's going to work in the world when we focus on our activity first instead of prioritizing prayer.
Yeah, I think prayer is just one of the ways God realigns us. He says, I know you care about this. I know you want to see this happen, but you're just not doing it my way yet. But just let's talk about that, and I'll adjust you. I'll help you see things differently. And prayer is, he's trying to get you set up so that he can work through you, and he will work through you. And so it's never a waste of time. It's there's a lot more happening in that time with God than we might realize.
That's very true.
We see in Jesus' life just following the Father's work instead of creating his own plans. What are some ways that leaders can recognize where God's working and join him?
Yeah, when my dad wrote his book, Experiencing God, that was probably the single greatest insight that he shared was, again, it's not about what you do and how hard you work. It's about what God's doing. And you just want to get in on it. You want wherever God is at work, you want to just run as quick as you can and get right in the middle of that and be a part of that. And people used to always say to my dad, they would say, I can't tell how many times I heard someone say, well, Henry, you're just fortunate because God seems to be doing so much where you are, but he's not doing that where I am. And my dad would say, well, he is. The difference is apparently I recognize where he's at work where I am, and you're missing it. You're not seeing it. But he is working where you are too. So I would just say to folks, number one, if you want to be a part of what God's doing, you've got to have spiritual eyes to see, spiritual ears to hear. That's why Jesus kept saying, he that has eyes to see, let him see. He was saying God's activity can be going on all around you, right under your nose, but if you don't have spiritual eyes to see, you'll miss it. And that probably is the most fundamental thing that when people have gone through that course, Experiencing God, they'll say, suddenly I began recognizing that God was at work in my family, my neighbor, my own life. There was all kinds of stuff God was doing. I just had not had any idea. So if you don't recognize God's activity, then you're going to be focusing on something else where God's not working and not blessing, and then you're going to get frustrated. And had you just made an adjustment and just put your life over here where God was clearly at work, you would have been thrust into all kinds of wonderful activity. But so you have to recognize. That's why, I think if you start out every day in prayer, God has an opportunity, first of all, to let you know what's on his heart right then, and maybe to put certain people on your heart. You went to pray, and then God put this particular person on your heart, so you just realize, I better just reach out. Maybe I need to have coffee with that person today. Well, then next thing you know, you're leading them to Christ, and they were ready, and they were hungry for that. But and God knew that, and God knew that's where you need to invest today. But if you hadn't been praying and you just got up and you're following your weekly schedule, you might never have joined him where he was. So number one, just be praying about it. But number two, learn to recognize things that only God can do. And there are just some things that, like God says, nobody seeks me on their own. We're all sinful. We're alienated from God. We're hostile toward God. But the Spirit of God draws people to himself. And so when you realize that, you might have conversations with 10 people that day, and a bunch of them are just very ordinary. But then you talk to one person, and it's just very clear that they're under conviction. They're seeking. They've never talked about spiritual things before, but they are today. And all of a sudden you realize, wait a minute, that's only the Spirit of God could draw them to that place, could convict them of their sin. There's some things only the Spirit of God can do, and it's happening in this person's life. Well, clearly God's doing something here. So that needs to be a priority for me today. God may just be readjusting my schedule. So recognizing things only God can do, and then just keeping your spiritual eyes and ears open. It's interesting in the Beatitudes, it just says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. And so I take that to heart sometimes, to say, if I haven't seen God at work lately around me, well, one thing I might do is make sure my heart is pure. Because if my heart is full of other things, maybe it's blurring my vision now. But when my heart is right with God, it's amazing how much I see God everywhere I look. And so there's lots of ways to address that. But I would say, number one, if someone comes up, and I've had people come up to me and just say, you just have never been where I serve. God doesn't know the address of where I'm working. He's doing a lot of things in Kenya right now or India right now, but not in my location. I would say, no, I don't think it's a God issue. I think it's your spiritual sight issue. You're just not seeing clearly what's happening right now. Address your ability to see what God's doing. Make sure you're able to see God and what his activity. Recognize the kind of things that are on God's heart. Sometimes we want God to do what's on our heart. So we keep looking at the things that matter to us, and then we don't see God there. And that God would say, that's because that's not where I'm working. You're looking where you want me to be. You're looking and focusing on what you want me to do, but you're a servant. And Jesus said, the servant will be where the master is. The servant does not call the master to come join him where he is. The servant goes to be where the master is at work. And so learn to recognize the activity of God. And once you begin to recognize his activity, you'll be swept off your feet with how many places you start to see him at work.
I love all that you just said there. It reminded me of a conversation we were just having in a leadership cohort that we're leading right now with leaders around Western Europe. And we got talking about having no margin in our life to see God show up, that we're scheduled so busy that we run from task to task to task. And we were talking about we don't have any space for those God moments, those God interruptions. It was a really great conversation and great reminder that if we really want to see God working, if we really say that we want to be a part of the things God's doing, we have to leave time in our life for God to put that person on our heart, for us to have that random conversation on the street, whatever it might look like. But I think sometimes we are so busy with these good tasks that there's no way for God to bring those God moments into our lives.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And, you never see, Jesus was very, very busy, but you never see him in a hurry. He's never rushing to an appointment. In fact, he's agonizingly, you've got a synagogue leader say, my child's about to die. Hurry and come help me. My daughter is near death's door. And then some hemorrhaging woman touches Jesus and he's focusing on her. I could imagine, the man is like, we don't have time to just randomly start talking to women that touch you in the public square here. I need you to go with me. But Jesus was just never in a hurry. And at the end of the day, everything that God intended for him to do is done. And he's changing the world, but in a steady pace of just trusting God. So I think you're exactly right. That's, if you're going 90 miles an hour, it's hard to notice what's happening beside you. You slow down, you start to get a much more focused view of what's happening in the world around you. And I've seen that all the time, even with missionaries that will be racing all over the place trying to reach lost people, and they're unaware that stuff's going on in their own child's life, right at home in their house. And they're blown away. I had no idea this was going on. It's like, well, why would you not have noticed? This person lives under the same roof as you, but because I've been going 90 miles an hour and not paying attention. And you start slowing down, you start to see all kinds of stuff you hadn't noticed before.
So one of the things you emphasize in the book is spiritual leaders needing to raise up the next generation. What are some of the most effective ways leaders can be developing those emerging leaders?
Yeah, I've said we're all called to be servants, but leaders lead people, and so it's one thing to lead followers. It's an entirely other thing to lead leaders. To lead leaders, you have to be the kind of leader that people want to follow, and that means you've got to grow as a leader, and that means that you have to make it a priority to be raising up other leaders. I've known some great missionaries and ministers, pastors that had a great servant's heart, but they didn't have the ability to raise up other leaders. They were just solitary servants their whole ministry. They worked hard, but they never had anybody coming alongside working with them. Number two, you never grew as a leader. You just kept on serving and working hard, but you never made it a priority to raise up other leaders. And so your ministry was always quite small because it was always built around you. Had you built a team of leaders working with you, your ministry would have been multiplied many times over. But that takes growth, and it's not always natural for people. But when you begin to make that raising up leaders a major part of your ministry, then you start keeping an eye out for that. And so when I was a pastor, everywhere I've ever been, I've got my work to do, but I realize part of my work is to raise up other leaders. So I'm always keeping an eye out for people. And when God puts them in my path, and it might be a young person, and I just realize, could this be someone God is entrusting to me, that if I could just help them to grow, that they might multiply over. They've got skills I don't have. They have abilities I don't have. If I could just harness those and put them on the team, then suddenly our team would have way more impact than just me working hard. And I have, whenever I have, like, a pastor or a missionary will say, but I know I need to be developing leaders, but I just don't have the time. I'd say, well, then you don't have a clue what would happen in your ministry if you could double your manpower. You the most time efficient thing you could do is add 3 or 4 more people to your team, and now you've quadrupled the impact or more than that of your effort. But so you have to have an eye for it, and you have to realize that's a priority, and you make time. If you just make leaders with your extra time, you'll never make leaders. You make it a priority to focus on them. And there's lots of things you can do with that. One is just always, I tell pastors a lot of times, if you're going to go do a ministry, you're going to go visit someone in the hospital, you're going to go do whatever it is you're going to do, always be thinking about who you could take with you. Take that teenager with you and show them what it's like to go visit someone who's dying. Go pray with them in the hospital, or to go witness to someone. Just bring this young person with you, or maybe not a young person, but just always be thinking, why would I do this alone? If I could have someone with me, why would I not bring someone with me so they see how exciting it is to lead someone to Christ? And they see how I did it. And then I bring them again, and I invite them to share, and I'm training them. And now they don't even have to be with me anymore, and they're just doing it on their own. Well, I've just multiplied my impact right there. So, and just the conversations you have. I've had people that literally, I had a guy several years ago, he lived 3-hour drive away from me, and he found out I was going to be traveling to a different city, different state to speak. And he said, listen, if I drive 3 hours over to your house, will you let me drive you the hour and a half to where you're going? And I'll drive you back, and then I'll drive 3 hours back to my house. And you just tell me what you want to drink, what kind of soft drink, whatever you want, and I'll have it in the cup holder when I pull up in front of your house. But he said, all I'm asking is you just let me talk to you and ask you questions while we're driving. And I thought, well, that's awesome. Yeah, that would be wonderful. So he had a list of questions, and the whole time we had this delightful conversation. And I thought, why don't I just do this all the time? Why don't I just have someone go with me so that in this commute time, I'm pouring into another leader. I'm double dipping here on this trip. And so, when you start to have that mentality, and that now you see a dozen other people out there serving. And the other thing I would just say with that is, a lot of times the problem with leaders is that we're afraid to give our work away, because then, well, what will we do? People will start to think we're redundant now because you've given all your work away to other young, talented people. But I've found I can never give enough work away. God always gives me more to do. And so the moment I give something away, that if someone else can do it, I just assume they should do it. But now with that space, now I can go into new territory I've never gone into before. And I can develop some things I've always wanted to do, hadn't had the time before. And so it doesn't mean I'm doing any less. I may be doing more, because if I'm doing something that I could give away, it's probably a lower level thing. And so I give the lower level things away. Now I've got room for the higher level things that maybe only the leader can do. But sometimes we just we care about what people think about us, and we want to appear to be very important and very busy, very swamped, because it seems spiritual to do that. And God would say, just keep giving that stuff away, develop leaders, and then I'll fill you up with, more impactful things, more fruitful activities, now that you've got some space and room in your life to do that. So yeah, I just feel for any minister, always be thinking about, who am I developing to take over and to do, or maybe I'm still doing the work as well, but now I've got 2 people doing the same work. And so we're having twice the impact. It's not about, ministry is not just about addition, it's about multiplication. You don't want to just add a little bit more. You want to multiply yourself, multiply your effort, multiply the witness. And that comes from raising up other leaders, not just, you raise up a follower and you're doing addition, but you raise up leaders and now you're doing multiplication. And that you start to see a movement develop when you do that.
Well, is there anything else that you'd like to challenge our audience with, just as we kind of wrap up here?
Well, I've kind of been touching on this, but just What I've realized for myself is when I stop growing, other people pay the price. Other
Mm.
people will suffer when I stop growing. And so as a leader, no matter how busy I am, I've always got to be growing. I've always got a stack of books, all it queued up for me to read, to be thinking about. There's always every time I get in my car, a leadership podcast is popping in. It starts playing. Every time I'm around someone that I just see as God's using that has some insights I don't have, I just want to ask them questions. When I'm with other leaders, I'm always asking them, "What are you reading right now that really has challenged you?" And that's why I always have a long list of books on my desk to read, because I'm always finding new books that people say I've just got to read. It's really insightful on this. It's really stretched me here. But I'll tell you that those for me seem to have been the people that God has used the most powerfully, are the ones that just keep growing. They just because you can't give to others what you don't have yourself. So the more you have, the more you have to give. And so I just encourage your listeners, there's lots of ways to learn, but always having some kind of input into your life. And this podcast you're doing, that's great. I'd be listening to it every week if I was in your field, and I just realized you're focusing on things that I needed to know in my work. Just have steady input all the time. And hopefully a year from now, you're not leading the same way you were a year earlier. You pruned away unfruitful activities, and now this year will be the most fruitful year yet. And next year will be even better than that. So I really want to challenge folks. This is not a time just year in and year out, just same level of fruit. Every year with some good pruning ought to be a more fruitful year than the last one was.
That is such a great challenge. Thank you. I've enjoyed this entire conversation, and I really think our missionaries will enjoy listening to it also. We appreciate all your wisdom and your willingness to just share it with us and to put it in the book. So thank you for joining us today.
Oh, it's my privilege.
And we will, in the show notes, we'll put your websites, different ways people can reach out to you and follow you there, your podcast there. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with people to encourage them to check out? We'll have links to the spiritual leadership book, and anything else you'd like to suggest for people to check out?
Just maybe our Blackaby Ministries website has resources and things, and that's just blackaby.org. But we love to encourage folks. And I wanted to come to Portugal at some point. I've never been to Spain or Portugal. I was supposed to do a conference in Barcelona, and then it got moved over to like Lithuania, I think, instead. And Lithuania was fine, but I really wanted to go to Barcelona. So my son-in-law and daughter went to Portugal and Spain, I think a year ago, and took their two little daughters. And so I've got a little 6-year-old granddaughter who knows the difference between Spain and Portugal. And I thought that's pretty awesome. But I'll have I'd love to get there sometime myself. So
very well. You have an open invitation here. If you ever need an excuse to come over here and do some mentoring, and you can use that as an excuse to do that. So we'd love to have you.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show with us today. And I just pray this will be a blessing to many of our listeners. Well, that's all for this show, and we want to thank you again for spending your valuable time with us today.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider taking just a moment and giving us a great review. Your review will help people find the podcast and allow these resources to encourage more people. If you took something valuable away from this episode, please share it with someone who would enjoy it.
If you'd like to find the show notes, blog posts, and free resources for ministry and leadership, as well as some information on my book, Overflowing, visit kylefarran.com. That's KYLEFARRAN.com. Hope to see you soon on a future podcast.